7900 versus 4080 Super Shootout. Tale as old as time. Nvidia versus AMD. I finally got my hands on a 4080 Super. Took me a little while, but I was unwilling to pay a penny more than what these cards are supposed to retail for. So that took me a minute of hunting around to be able to track one of these down. I'm a little bit late to the game, but I'm going to give you kind of the average enthusiast's opinion on how these cards stack up, because that's what I am. I'm not a professional. I'm not monetized, and I just like this stuff. So we're going to go from there. You can see I got on the background here a couple of cards that I got that I'm testing. So we got the Radeon 7900 XTX from Powercolor, the Red Devil edition. And then we've got the Gigabyte Gaming OC for the 4080 Super. And I'm a function over form type of guy. I would much rather have the performance than the looks. Most of the builds I do, I go about as cheap as physically possible on the looks because I want every penny to just be dedicated to giving me some more horsepower out of my rigs. However, I am going to start the comparison off in this regard because I think it is one thing to consider. I know there are other enthusiasts out there who do value the looks and different things like that. So I'll start with the AMD. The Red Devil, I think it's pretty polarizing. It has an aesthetic. Red, I think, is kind of a little bit out of the popularity right now. A lot of people like cleaner looking builds in the classic red and black, but that's the Radeon color, so what are you going to do? And they're repping it hard on this thing. I've actually got my Red Devil right here with me, and I just want to point out a couple of things. So I bought this card originally back in, I think, June of 23, so I've had it a little while. When I initially made my purchase this generation, I was like, I'm doing it. I'm going all in on AMD. We'll see where that gets us. And the MSRP at the time was $999. And I was able to actually pick this card up when it was pretty new for under MSRP. I was able to get $949, so about $50 off. And the thing I want to point out here is this card, whether you like its design or not, just feels like an extremely premium card. I'm getting this under MSRP, but it doesn't feel like it. If you come along the edges here, it's got a nice metal casing around the outside. It does have a plastic front face, but it's got the metal around the side. It's got reinforced metal down the edge. It's got the metal back plate. You've got your Red Devil emblem that's RGB on the back. You've got a nice RGB around the outside here. And then you've got these nice, pretty simple 3-fan design. This is definitely a massive card. They went with the 3 8-pin connectors, so just a traditional power connector. But overall, this card feels very premium to be able to get it under MSRP. And I was able to do that pretty much just, a couple months after release, and then they've remained under MSRP. So you can pick up a 7900 XTX for well under the $1,000 nowadays. I've seen them as low as $920, and that's going to play a huge part into, I think, the results that we talk about here at the end. For the 4080 Super, I actually, it's in the computer I am recording on right now, so I don't have the physical item to be able to show you, because the only computer I have strong enough to truly test these cards is my primary computer. I got the 7800X3D CPU in it and 32 gigs of DDR5, and none of my other rigs were going to be able to push these to the limit. So I got to keep a card in there. Right now, the 4080 is the one in there. But I do want to go over, if you take a look at my background here, the Gigabyte. Once again, not a huge, looks kind of guy, but just as far as quality feel goes, when you look at the 4080 Super, this Gigabyte model, their base model for the $999, which is now the MSRP of the new 4080 Super, is the Wind Force. And then they have the Gaming OC. As far as I can tell, they're almost exactly the same, except for the Gaming OC has these RGBs around the fans. But just overall quality, they're upcharging you $50. So the MSRP of the 4080 Super $999, and then because they're giving you what they, I guess, would consider a more premium model, it goes for $1,049, and for the $49, you're getting a factory overclock, which to me is not really worth much. And then they've added in these RGBs. I'll just be honest with you. I plugged it into my computer. I immediately thought they were hideous. Like, who thought this color scheme was good? It's this weird white, orange, blue, kind of spirals around. It's kind of tacky. I know I could get in there and change it. I will eventually. But just out of the box, just doesn't feel nearly as premium. It's completely just plastic housing and casing around the outside. Just for your money's worth, you know, I felt like I saved $50 on the Radeon and it felt premium. And the Gigabyte, I felt like I was spending extra money and it just didn't feel so premium when I pulled it out of the box. It just wasn't nearly as exciting for my initial purchase. And I know you don't have to buy the Gigabyte, but unfortunately at the time of me purchasing and recording, that was the only card that I was able to scoop up anywhere near MSRP or their retail price. Almost everything was scalped and looking at $1,200 plus. So that's where I'll leave it at for the feel of the cards in the initial unboxing. I'll just say that the Radeon card feels more premium, but we'll have to see how it goes in the performance. So for the performance, I did test it in my main rig, so I want to give a couple of kind of key points on this. It is my main rig. I was recording on the same device that I was testing, so none of these benchmarks are meant to be like max effort. I'm not running like a simplified OS. I'm not trying to scream these things to the moon. My goal here was to put them both in my personal computer, run the benchmarks the way I would be gaming if I was just using it personally. And then I just kept the conditions as close to the same as possible for both cards. So if I had OBS opened on one, I obviously have it open on the other because I'm recording. If I had, you know, my spreadsheet where I record all the results open on one, I had it on the other. So this isn't a max effort benchmark. This is just all things equal, one versus the other, and just kind of what I saw going through the testing on it. And as far as my rig goes, I've got an ASRock motherboard. I think it's the B550 in there. I've got the 7800X3D. I've got 32 gigs of G.Skill DDR5, 6000 megahertz, CL30 RAM, and then it's all running off a 4 terabyte M2 drive. So pretty standard high performance gaming setup. If you're looking at something in this league, you could probably expect very similar results. All right, right out of the gate, first test up, we got Modern Warfare 3. You'll notice that every one of these, I'm going to do 1440p, then 4K on the backside. And the 1440p, a lot of these, even though I was running at full screen, the capture card would not make it take up the full screen. So that's why you got some of the black gap at the bottom. But as you can see here, this game heavily AMD biased. Modern Warfare 2 was the exact same way. When you look at overall performance here, 7900 XTX coming in at 202 FPS average with 98 on the 1% low. And then the 4080 coming in at 157 with 113 on the 1% low. And you're going to notice as we go through these benchmarks, this seems to be a very common trend. The Radeon card's got a lot of horsepower, but it seems like I was constantly just getting a larger spread between the average and the 1% lows. I don't know if that was maybe potentially impacted by recording the background or anything like that, but both cards were kept completely equal for the circumstances, and that's just the way they laid out. So once again, we can take a look at, now we're up in the 4K on the Modern Warfare 3, 7900 XTX coming in at 127 on average with 71 on the 1% low, and then the 4080 Super coming in at 104. So significantly slower on average, but actually a little bit better on that 1% low with the 76. Thought it was pretty interesting, even at 4K native on extreme, both of these cards highly capable. So no upscaling required, and that is going to be the same for all these benchmarks. So these are just going to be max effort, no upscaling, everything the highest settings every time. Everything's always going to be highest. This isn't necessarily how I would play every one of these games, but it is how I'm testing them just to get a raw performance versus performance of one card versus the other. And then, of course, when I actually play games, I'd go in and tweak the settings a little bit more to my needs. But up next here, we got Counter-Strike 2. As you can see, just doing a run around DDoS 2, and both cards more than you'd ever want. This is 1440p, 7900 XTX at 398, 1% low of 127, and then 396 on the 4080 Super with the 1% low of 276. So once again here, you can see those 1% lows significantly higher on the 4080. They're just about tied on the average, but I would definitely prefer that higher 1% low. You're not going to get any sort of stuttering or any dips in FPS, and really those large dips in FPS, that's what your eyeball can really pick out. Now, once we come in here to the 4K, once again, averages are almost tied, 205 versus 197 on the 7900 XTX versus the 4080 Super, but then once again, 98 versus 151, the lows way better on the NVIDIA card. Overall, they're both going to give you an extremely smooth experience, but if you were going to notice any of the dips, it would definitely be coming from the Radeon. Up next here is FORTNITE. Now, these are obviously not the settings your average Joe would play FORTNITE at. I went ahead, had these all the way maxed out. I did test it with and without the hardware ray tracing. Interestingly enough, though, because this is running DirectX 12 and the Unreal Engine 5, it has Lumen and Nanite enabled, which are some of those new toys from Unreal Engine 5. And the hardware ray tracing really didn't make a whole lot of difference. Both cards dropped a little bit. This is with that off, and at 1440p, you can see 7900 XTX about 67, 47 to 1% low, and the 4080 Super 70 with 51 to the 1% low. Both these cards running Lumen and Nanite very close neck to neck, and you see the exact same thing. We come down here to 4K. Once again, within a couple FPS of each other. The 7900 XTX is 38 on average, 28 on the lows, and then 41 on average, 32 on the lows for the Super. So this was the first game I tested with the Lumen Global Illumination, and I was really curious to see if one brand kind of excelled at that better than the other. And really not a clear winner here. Either one of these cards are very close to each other, and ultimately, obviously, we would need to implement some sort of upscaling if we wanted to play at these settings. But I think it's pretty obvious we wouldn't play at those settings. We would just go ahead and get more competitive settings in there. Next up, we got Forza. This one actually did allow me to do it full screen at the 1440p. These are maxed out settings. Ray tracing is still off at this point in time. All these tests are going to have ray tracing off from what you're seeing on screen. However, I do have those numbers compiled at the end, and we will compare them. But same trend stands here. Average on the Radeon's a little bit higher, 140 on the average, 80 on the 1% low. And then for the Super, it's going to be... just a little bit behind. I actually missed it there, but they're pretty dang close. 1% low is higher on the Super again. And then here for 4K, it's going to be 94 with 60 on the low, and then 96 with 76 on the low. So Super actually wins out a little bit in 4K, where it was actually a little bit slower at 1440, which is interestingly kind of a reversal on this game. A lot of the other games, the 7900 XTX had a slight edge in the 4K. I don't know if it's the extra VRAM or what, but it was able to pull it off on the high end. But in Forza, it actually reversed. Super had a slight advantage in 4K. But either one of these cards, perfectly capable of just absolutely maxing out this game. Next up, Cyberpunk here. So Cyberpunk's known, for being the absolute ray tracing card destroyer. But if you don't turn ray tracing on, this game still looks amazing. And what's really interesting is this game's known for destroying AMD because of those ray tracing facts. But here you can see if you just turn it off, AMD taking a hard win here. 7900 XTX at 120 average, 89 on the 1% low. And then the Super only at 105, 85 on the 1% low. So the gap is smaller on the Super once again. But the 7900 XTX just purely wins on numbers, average, and lows on Cyberpunk. Just proves that without ray tracing, you can still have a heck of an experience on this game. Still looks great. years later. But next up here, we'll have the 4K playback. So let's take a look here. So there you go, 4K. So a little bit of a swap here once again. So 7900 XTX coming in at 59 on the average, 47 on the 1% low, and then the Super coming in 60 with 52 on the 1% lows. The Super just about tied. That could be run-to-run variation, but did technically take the win with 1 extra FPS, but then the 1% low is about 5 higher, so that's pretty nice. But I still was impressed. It just shows if you're not needing to use ray tracing, both these cards extremely capable, even running 4K native. So, you know, you get into a lot of the whole like DLSS versus FSR. You don't even need to upscale at all. You don't need either of them. Just run it native, man. You got the powerhouse. Both these cards absolutely slaying here. You know, you're averaging 60 FPS on 4K native. You're winning in my book. That's pretty impressive, even if it is a little bit of an older game. Still killer results. All right, and then next up, we got The Last of Us. Once again, a little bit of a win here for the Super. So 7900 XTX averaging 105 with 75 in the 1% low. And then the Super coming in 118 on average with 98 in the 1% low. And overall, both these run the game exceedingly well. This game, when it first came out, was a real tough port. It was not easy to run. Didn't come over well from the PlayStation, but it's been patched all up. And this one now is very fluid, very plays very well on PC nowadays, I should say, which is good to see that they actually went out and fixed it. But the 4080 Super div had the advantage there. And then here we go, we swap over to 4K, and in the average, the 7900 XTX actually starts making a little bit of a comeback here. He's 68 on average, 47 on the 1% low, and then the Super 67 on average, 57 on the 1% low. So once again, they're just about tied on average, but that RTX 4080 Super just really killing it in the 1% lows again, which is really what you're going to notice when you're playing games. So I did not expect it to play out this way when I was initially doing the testing, but this was a very common trend. And at the end, we'll have all of the results and we'll have some analysis and some of the actual differences in numbers. And you'll see those 1% lows ended up being kind of a big deal between these two cards by the time it was all done. For Resident Evil, I think this is a really well optimized game. It looks amazing and it runs really well at all different settings. This is all the settings maxed out, no ray tracing on at this point in time, and absolute huge win for the RTX 4080. You're looking at it pumping out 167 on average, 129 in the 1% low, and then the 7900 XTX coming in at 126 on average, 74 in the 1% low. I was pretty surprised by this one as well. I had to go back and recheck all of my settings because I was like, there's no way that it's getting destroyed that hard. But the settings were all exactly the same, which was surprising to me. But then in 4K, 7900 XTX attempts to make a huge comeback. It closes the gap a ton. It's going 87 on average, 58 in the 1% low versus the Super's 92 and 79 in the 1% low. So the 4080 Super is still pulling off a win here. But at 4K, that 7900 XTX tried to make a big comeback, just fell a little bit short, unfortunately. All right, Helldivers 2, newest title out. Everybody's kind of been joking about how beautiful and fun this game is, but also how hard it is to run. 1440p here. You're going to have a great experience on both these. 7900 XTX pulling off the 120 with the 75 and the 1% low, and the Super's coming out 139 on average, 106 and 1% low. So this is another title that was a pretty strong win for the Super. And then in 4K, it feels awesome to play this game in 4K native. Just looks great. But once again, Super's taking the win here. 7800 XTX could pull out 68 on average, 49 in the 1% low, and the Super comes out 83 and 73. So pretty strong win for the Super. So if you're trying to get into Helldivers, NVIDIA might be the card for you. Hogwarts Legacy up. We gave a couple wins there to NVIDIA, so we got to get one back for AMD. Here we go. So 142 on average for the 7900 XTX, 70 on the 1% low, and then 130 for the 4080 Super on average, 52 on the 1% low. So if you're a big Hogwarts fan, you just love playing Wizard, here you go. You can be a AMD bro and support Team Red, because they pulled off a little bit of a win here. But either one of these, absolutely great experience. You're going to be happy either way, especially a single player game. Like, we're talking 100 plus frames per second. Like, what are we doing here? Either one of these are going to be great. So we switch over to 4K, still an extremely playable on both these. AMD pulls off the win once again, 79 on average, 54 on the 1% low, and then NVIDIA coming out 72 and 41 respectively. So this game does look absolutely amazing, and I'm usually not a big movie game fan. Those usually turn out pretty bad. I haven't had a whole ton of time to invest in this game at all, but even just playing the intro and taking a look at it, I was like, this shows promise. It's probably not your average just movie ripoff that they put no effort into. It looks like it might be pretty fun, especially for my wife. I told her she should play it because that seems like right up her alley. And then PALWORLD. This is the opposite story. I've sunk way too much time into this game for probably what it's worth, but PALWORLD, the win goes back to NVIDIA. So there's another Unreal Engine 5 game, but it's not really pulling off a bunch of the big tricks that some of the other Unreal Engine games are playing. This one's pretty straightforward. I will say Unreal Engine 5 games are relatively hard to just run native. They respond extremely well to upscaling, but just to keep all things equal, all these benchmarks are, of course, native. And the 7900 XTX pulling off 73.39 on the 1% low, and then the 4080 Super is 83 and 67 on the 1% low. So the NVIDIA is pulling off the win. And it seems like in general, NVIDIA, not always, but they seem to do a little bit better in the Unreal Engine 5 games. And then as soon as I say that, Remnant comes out, and Remnant 2, AMD takes the win. So this game was giving me all sorts of trouble on MSI Afterburner and trying to get my overlays set up on AMD, but both cases there, 4K, 1440p, AMD took the win on Remnant 2. Another game I haven't really played yet. I should get into this one. It looks like a blast, but it seems like guys keep getting busier and busier, and I spend more time looking at games, less time playing games. All right, Returnal. Speaking of which, this game grabbed me like immediately. I don't usually play this type of game, but the second I started playing it, I was like, oh, I'm hooked. But regardless, pretty tight scores here. AMD and NVIDIA just neck and neck on this one. 136 on average for the AMD, 73 on the low, 133 on average, and 70 on the low for the NVIDIA. Just between the two cards, you're never going to notice the difference in this game. They are so close together. I could probably run this 3 more times, and the numbers might swap just from run to run. But this game does look great. This was another PlayStation port, and highly recommend. A lot of fun, really unique, cool visuals. In the 4K, we go back to AMD pulling off a slight win on the average, 82, and then a slight loss on the 1% low. So 41 on the 1% low, and then the 4080 Supers pulling out 76 and 44. At least I can say that these cards are pretty damn consistent game to game. They compare to each other over and over and over again, just very, very similarly. There are a couple outlier games where one pulls off a huge win versus the other, back and forth, but I was really shocked just how neck and neck these cards just kept coming out with just very similar results over and over again, which is nice that they're so repeatable. And then ROBOCOP. This game, absolute blast from the past. 7900 XTX, 92 on average, 59 on the 1% low, and then the 4080 Super, 86 on average, 63 on the 1% low. The one thing I will say about this game, though, is obviously we can run it natively here at 1440p, but the FSR implementation looks like dog shit in this game. Like, absolute dog shit. So when we go up to 4K here in a second, you're going to see you probably want to upscale. And on AMD, it just does not look very good. There's a lot of shimmering, a lot of inconsistency. I might have a video that compiles some of the things I found wrong with FSR eventually. But here we go in 4K. As you can see, still playable. It's 45 on average for the 7900 XTX with 30 in the 1% low. And then for the Super, it's 47 and 34 on the 1% low. So very similar performance on the two cards. But it is a first-person shooter. So you're obviously going to probably want to upscale if you're playing this for real. And you would get, you know, roughly about that 1440 performance if you ran it in quality mode. But you're going to have a better image quality by far in this game in particular with DLSS versus the FSR. The FSR just, like I said, looks like absolute dog shit. So that's unfortunate. I wish that didn't occur. There's some games where it's not too bad, but that's one of them. It's just bad. All right. Starfield, the two cards are right on par again at 1440p. It's an extremely playable experience. 88 on the average for the 7900 XTX, and then 54 on the 1% low, and then for the 4080 Super, 87 and 61. So once again, just about tied on average. AMD loses in the 1%. Seems to be just over and over and over again, which was a little bit sad because I really liked that Red Devil card. I wanted him to do well. This game's been patched a ton as well. It definitely runs a lot better than it did, but I think there's no excuse for the performance based on what it actually looks like. Am I the only one? I think this game just looks like really ugly. I don't know why. I never really thought it was impressive looking. It looks like a Bethesda game on steroids that just turned out wrong. Is what it looks like, but here you go, 4K. You can tell it's been patched because now both these cards can pull off a very playable experience native. 7900 XTX coming in at 61 on average, 41 on the low, and the 4080 Super coming in at 57 and 44. So I remember when this thing first came out, I was like 4090 couldn't run it, and now look, you got both these cards doing native 4K, no problem. So I am glad that people actually take the time to their trash fucking games, because it's just annoying that they come out the way they come out sometimes. But I get it. Got to stabilize it for the console first, get it to the masses, and then, you know, fix it later after you get scathing reviews. Makes total sense to me. And then Jedi Survivor. So just talking about patching games. Jedi Survivor did get patched a lot, but I don't think they quite went far enough, because both these cards, just every time you get into a complicated fight, or not even complicated fight, just get into a fight, it's like the 1% lows were like pretty bad on both cards. So bad that I gave them both a couple freebie runs that I was like, I'm going to retry that run because I just don't even want to advertise that. And I was like, no, that's the game. That's the game. So 1440p wasn't too bad. The 7900 XTX definitely took the win on average, 102, but lost on the 36 on 1% lows. And then once you bump it up to 4K, though, this is what I'm talking about. So you see on the 4080 Super, 15 on the 1% low. I was like, there's no way. So I must have... I gave it like a couple free extra runs to be like, what's going on here when I was kind of fighting through this. Because these aren't like perfectly identical runs. You know, I'm just going through here doing my thing. And like every time there was some sort of hang up or frame drop. And I don't really blame the card on this one. It's just this game. When it first released, like, yeah, boss fights and stuff were like unplayable. And they obviously fixed it quite a bit, but I think it's still just not quite there. Next up, Alan Wake 2. Huge fan of this game. If you haven't tried it, highly recommend it. If you like slow-paced thrillers, I definitely do myself. But the interesting thing is, this is another game where it's known for just absolutely destroying AMD on the ray tracing. But right here, if you're just willing to play with it off, the game looks absolutely beautiful. And the 7900 XTX runs it just fine. 83 on the average at 1440p, 56 on 1% low, and then the Super coming out at 80 on average. You go up to 4K. This is below my 60 frames per second that I'd like to see, but it's third person. It's a really slow-paced game. So both these extremely playable. 7900 XTX coming in at 44 and 31 on the low, and then the Super coming in at 45 and 38 on the low. You could still have a great experience playing this natively. Now, if it was me, obviously, I would just do the quality upscaling, and you'd get results that you saw in the 1440p within a couple FPS. So that's how way I would actually play it. But yeah, if you're not looking for ray tracing, either one of these cards, absolutely beautiful, even at 4K native, and you could play the whole game at like 45 FPS and probably have a great time, because it's just a super slow, game. You're walking around trying to figure things out, looking at your little case board, being your little FBI detective or whatever. Doesn't really require a whole lot. And then Borderlands, this is a little bit of an older game, but I still know people love to play Borderlands, and it's a little bit different aesthetic to it. I wanted to see how it ran. And here the RTX takes out a big win again. So on the 7900 XTX, you're looking at 135 on average, 77 on the 1% low. And then on the Super, you're looking at 151 on average, 98 on the 1% low. So this is one of those games where the NVIDIA is taking the win on average and 1% low pretty significantly. But obviously, either one of these you'd have a good experience on. Oh, it looks like I messed up my numbers there at the bottom, but the afterburner display is on there. So 4K on Borderlands 3, obviously those averages in the bottom are not correct, so ignore them, don't look at these. But you can see up top, we've got our average FPS right here and our 1% low right here. So for the 4080 Super, we're coming in average here in the low 80s and 67 on the FPS. And then for the AMD, we got 75 on the average and 33, it looks like, on the 1% low. I'm wondering if that had a little bit of a frame dip when I reset it or something, because that seems a little bit low. Maybe not, though. It is what it is. Let's see by the end what it looks like. But nope, yep, it's even going down. So you can see some frame time spikes here. It's legitimately having a little bit of a problem. And then the last game we tested, Plague Tale. Absolutely beautiful game. When you look at like the foliage and stuff in the background, I don't know if it's like the lighting or like something. It just looks so damn good. But anyway, 1440p, pretty close, but the Super takes the win again. So 7900 XTX coming in at 83 on average, 54 on the 1% low, and then the Super coming out 88 on average, 66 in the 1% low. The other thing about this game is, even though it looks so great, there's not a huge VRAM tax on it. As you can see there, even the allocated on both of them is about 8.5 gigs, so not super taxing for how beautiful. And I was surprised with just all the stuff on the screen. I thought I was going to be absolutely destroying it, but not really. And then next up, 4K. Still both of these excellent experience. 7900 XTX coming up 55 on average, 36 on the 1% low, and then the Super coming up 50 and 41. So losing out slightly on the average, but winning by just as much on the 1% lows again. And even at 4K here, you can see both of them well within their VRAM limits. In fact, the AMD's actually been a little more efficient here. I'm only showing 9.5 allocated, and 4080 Super, I don't know what it was pumping out, but it's doing 11.3 allocated there. But game looks absolutely beautiful. Both cards, very capable, very capable. All right, so that's all the footage I got from in-game for you guys. I did go ahead and select out some of the titles that offered ray tracing to turn it on or off, and I did benchmark both of them with the ray tracing on and off, but I didn't want to belabor the point and go through just the continual footage, but I do have all the numbers here. So what we're going to look at is I've got the average and 1% lows for both the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX displayed here. And then we're going to go through the 4K, the 1440, and then as well as the ray tracing. So first, this is all rasterized performance. And I will say I was really shocked at just how well matched these two cards were. I mean, every single time, if you look down through here, it's, you know, AMD took a slight win, NVIDIA took a slight win, NVIDIA slight win, AMD slight win, AMD slight win. I mean, these cards are so neck and neck that if we were just looking at raster performance, it would just be, you know, buy the one that's cheaper, because they're just back and forth. Unless you've got one very specific game that you want to play, these things are just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But we also have to talk about the overall trend. So these second bars here is those 1% lows. So like, for example, Plague Tale Requiem, the AMD won on average and then loses on 1% low. Borderlands 3, yeah, that was a huge loss on 1% low. I don't know what the hell is going on in that game for AMD. And then, you know, every once in a while one comes along. Frontiers of Pandora actually didn't have the footage on there of that one, but you know, these are almost perfectly paired. NVIDIA just coming in, just, you know, these two different bars look very close to each other. Just AMD took a little bit of a loss, but at least, you know, the difference in 1% lows and everything are pretty tight. But that's all the numbers, how they fell. And to give you a more digestible idea, I went ahead and calculated out the difference. So that was kind of the visual representation, but that gets real busy just because there was 19 games I tested in all. And so I went ahead and gave the tabular format, which it's like, why do I care about that? Well, because of what's the bottom here. So if you look at the 7900 XTX versus the 4080 Super, in average FPS, the 7900 XTX that's basically 1.5% faster if you average all 19 games together. But then the big takeaway here is, on the flip side, the 1% lows, it's about 17.5% slower on the 1% lows, which we saw again and again and again and again throughout that footage. It was like neck and neck, neck and neck, neck and neck on the average, like taking a win, taking a loss, taking a win. And you can see they just about averaged out, giving a slight lead, you know, 1.5%, if you call that a lead, to the 7900 XTX. But then the 1% lows rear their ugly head. It was about 17.5% slower there. And that difference in the average and that 1% low is what your eye is really going to pick up on, because it's going to be that change of rate is what you're going to see. We've got the results for 1440p here as well. We'll find much of the same. These cards are just going to go back and forth, trading blows. You can see here NVIDIA wins. We come down, some AMD wins. They're just going to be absolutely back and forth, almost to the point that there's just no clear advantage in the raster realm. 1440p, the numbers are just significantly higher, obviously, because the resolution lower. But the nice thing is, you know, both these cards were very capable at running native 4K. But what's probably more realistic is you're going to run some sort of upscaling when you're gaming. And there's a slight difference between running a native 1440p and running like DLSS quality from 4K, getting it upscaled from 1440p to 4K. But these numbers are going to be pretty close to what you can expect. So as you can see here, pretty much all games tested. Here's your 60 frames per second. Pretty much everything's clearing that on average. Most of them's clearing it on 1% low as well, except for a couple of these games up here. And then even here at like 90 frames per second, almost everybody's clearing it. So the good news is on these cards, even the newest AAA titles, even if you got a 4K screen, you're going to be able to find some sort of middle ground on settings that's going to give you the FPS that you want to see, which I would hope so. These are both, you know, in the realm of $1,000 cards. So these are not anything to be taken lightly. You know, the era of just like 4090 or bust, maybe that's still going on, but just with the prices of the 4090 and the fluctuations and the fact that nobody's seen one at MSRP for, you know, years, pretty much since release, like those are like almost out of the question for like almost everybody. I would argue that both the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX are probably out of a lot of people's realm as well. But to me, these two cards are important because this is like probably the closest realm of achievable high performance that I think your average dude's going to go for. I mean, sure, maybe you've got the funds or you just don't care and you go for the 4090, but I think these two cards are more in the realm of, you know, possible for extreme performance. And looking at what they can do, you know, whether you're running 1440p, you're going to have a great experience, and if you're 4K, you can definitely upscale and get what you need. But here we go back to the tabular view. Here's all the actual numbers supporting it, and this time around the 4080 Super catches up a little bit on average and then just even destroys it even harder on that 1% low. So what we're seeing basically is oops, you guys can't see that too well. Boom, there we go. All right, so from going from the 7900 XTX to the 40 Super, you're basically a half of a percentage point faster on the 7900 XTX, and that's almost, it's pretty much game to game. One game, one's going to do better. The next game, the other's going to do better. And when you average it all together, I mean, that's like practically perfectly equal. Like, these cards are very matched, which I found interesting because I think, you know, and everybody's going to have a little bit slightly different results and runs and stuff. But, you know, when the 4080 Super first came out, everybody said, you know, the 7900 XTX was about 5% faster in raster, but then obviously lost in ray tracing. And then when the Super came out, you know, they were like, it's at best like 1, sometimes maybe up to 3 was what was advertised faster than the regular 4080. But like, I found it was hard to even find anyone that could see 3% improvement. Usually it was like dead even or like 1% improvement. So almost no difference. But here we are, at least in my results, these cards are like dead even in raster. And then really the biggest part of the story is that 1% low. So at 1440p here, you know, you can see, what is that? It's only 78% as fast. The 7900 XTX is only 78% as fast as the 4080 Super on the 1% lows. So this is really telling me is, you know, the absolute speed, you know, able to pull those averages. I would imagine that, you know, I didn't record the max FPS, but I'd imagine the 7900 XTX has got to be putting up some bigger maxes, because for it to lose out on the lows like that and still average out, there's got to just be a large kind of swing and variation. So on average, they're dead even, but, you know, you're just going to have a more consistent result out of that 4080 Super. And then the next step, what we got here is our ray tracing. So we're gonna kind of have to look into this a little bit more, because I didn't end up posting all the footage for this because I knew this video was going to go kind of long, and there's a lot to unpack here because we're gonna have a lot of other things to talk about here at the end. But when you look at ray tracing 4K, this is native. I don't think a whole lot of people hope to run 4K native ray tracing these days. These cards were pretty capable with a few exceptions. So Avatars of Pandora, I included it down here on the ray tracing because there is no option to turn it on or off. There's just like a little bit of ray tracing baked into the game, and it is a light load. So as you can see here, when the ray tracing is a light load, the AMD really doesn't take the hit you would think. It stays pretty well in position with its NVIDIA counterpart. So this is probably some of the most uniform, you know, average to 1% low between the two, with AMD just losing out a little bit. Probably just due to, you know, they do not perform as well with the ray tracing, and this is a game that has to have it on. But next up, Plague Tale Requiem. So this is a game where the hit came in a lot harder, and interestingly enough, NVIDIA, obviously performance is way stronger here with the ray tracing, but look at this 1% low gap here. It's actually tighter on the AMD. Now that just might be because, you know, the performance was already so much lower to begin with, but even the NVIDIA there, you know, 35, you're breaking 30 frames per second. that's, you know, probably better than the console experience. And we're talking 4K native with ray tracing, you know, that's pretty solid actually still, you know, from just a technical standpoint. But the 1% low dropping down to the 21, and then it's really not that bad though when you compare it to the AMD's averaging 24, barely beating out the 1% low there from NVIDIA, and then 17. And then the two titles we really got to park it on are Alan Wake 2, and then earlier, what's coming on in a minute, Cyberpunk. So Alan Wake 2, this is another game that is an absolute NVIDIA poster child. It does offer path tracing, and let me just tell you right now, if you think you even want to experiment with path tracing, AMD is not the way to go. Because, as you can see here, native 4K path tracing on Alan Wake 2, NVIDIA can rock 17 on average, 15 on the 1% low, and then AMD's down at 6 and 5. Now, you might think, like, well, both of those are unplayable, but on the NVIDIA, we can probably get this to a playable level. So we could do that DLSS upscaling, and then, you know, potentially this game also offers frame generation that's a little bit more mature on NVIDIA, and a couple other things to get this to a playable state. Whereas on the AMD, even if you upscale, even if you try to pull out all the tricks in the book, just nothing's going to get you to a playable state. It's just not going to be good. And you can run it ray tracing low, a couple different things, but it's just not going to give you that experience. However, we saw with ray tracing off, Alan Wake 2 was still beautiful, absolutely gorgeous game, ton of fun, and it ran great on the AMD. So you can definitely still on an AMD have great gaming experiences. You just got to realize that you got to have the discipline to just not even turn that ray tracing on, because you're only going to be disappointed, because you're going to spend, you know, $900 on this card just to immediately find some disappointment there. And that's ultimately what this is going to lead to, is there's just some sacrifices on AMD's side still, which I don't think should be news to anybody. But we'll go on through the rest of these. Jedi Survivor, I included it just because it's a newer title, but big surprise here too. AMD pulled out a win, and then that 1% low here on NVIDIA, I just don't think this game is still patched very well. It's obviously originally came out optimized more for consoles. Consoles all run AMD equipment, and then we kind of saw some funny interaction on the raster performance, and then I turned on ray tracing, and this was another one. I gave NVIDIA multiple runs on this because I was just thinking to myself, there's no way this is real. It's got to be a fluke. Every single run, I'd get into some sort of fight, and those frames would dip out, and there it was. So I wouldn't really count this one against the card. I think that's just more mainly a game, but that is a demonstration, you know. Either one of these, AMD or NVIDIA, can take a loss occasionally, just depending on optimization. Returnal, we saw that they were neck and neck between the two cards, and then you turn on the ray tracing, and just like you would expect, this is a game with very, you get exactly what you would expect. They're neck and neck like they should be with raster, and then ray tracing comes on. It hurts just a little bit harder to AMD. And then down here it's Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk 2077, I did not turn on the path tracing there because it was just going to look like Alan Wake and give another just absolutely abysmal result for AMD, and I would argue this is close enough. So this was with ray tracing on Psycho, or the highest you can set it without path tracing on. As you can see here, 4080, 28 on average, 24 on the 1% low, and then AMD 19 and 15. So even some of these heavier ray trace titles, even if they're not using path tracing, it's still going to give an advantage to NVIDIA. But that's not really new news. Forza Horizon, that's a very light load. You can see on the average, they're neck and neck, but then the 1% low drops off on AMD. And then FORTNITE, like I said, we were running this with the Lumen and the Nanite and everything, all the tricks of the trade for Unreal Engine 5 turned on, and adding in the hardware accelerated ray tracing didn't make a huge difference. This is about the same results we saw. It was like each card took like a 3 FPS hit when we enabled it versus just running everything that's included in Unreal Engine. So ultimately, this time, just so you take note, I switched the positions. So we were comparing 7900 to 4080. Now we're doing 4080 because he's in the lead, just to make the numbers easier to understand, versus the 7900 XTX. So with that, at 4K ray tracing, on average, it's 17, almost 18% faster for NVIDIA, and then on the 1% lows, it's about 25% faster. So that's pretty significant, which shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody. But I want to drive some of these points home so that we can kind of have a good conversation when we talk about my overall impressions between owning these two cards. And then here we go again, all the same results for 1440p. The one standout was Plague Tale with AMD. Once again, I ran it like 2 or 3 times, and every time I would get this massive stutter that would register hard enough that it would drop the 1% lows down to like 1. And at first, I wanted to get a run where I felt like it was more realistic, and then I did a couple runs and it happened every time, and I was like, this is realistic. Like, ray tracing on with these graphics absolutely maxed out, you just get these dips that hit you so hard it registers on the 1%. And then once again, Alan Wake, now we're at a position where on NVIDIA we're getting playable even with the path tracing and everything on, and AMD is just not even close. So if we go in here, once again, 4080 compared to the 7900 XTX, it's about 20% faster on average, and then 40% faster on the 1% lows. And that's probably mostly because that outlier on Plague Tale, but still, it's significant. You're looking at, across the board here, like, 15 to 25% more performance with ray tracing on. And even if you take out the outliers, I did the math. If you take out the outliers for Alan Wake and Cyberpunk, it's still 13 to 20% faster on the 4080 on ray tracing. So that's a lot to unpack. So we've covered, first of all, when it comes to the benchmarks, I just did 4K and 1440 absolutely max graphics because that's going to give us a baseline to just compare the actual performance. But there's other things besides for just the raw performance that you have to take into consideration here. And I'll kind of give you a spoiler to my conclusions. There's not a super easy answer. Now, I know what you're thinking. After seeing those results, there is a super easy answer. It's the 4080. It equals in raster, destroys in ray tracing. But there's a couple more things to this. Is the 7900 XTX has been out for months, and the price gets lower and lower and lower. You can pick these up. I think the last time I checked, it was like $920. The 4080 Super is almost zero improvement over the 4080. And what I find so funny about it is the 4080s were sitting on the shelf at like $1,200 and nobody wanted them. And suddenly they release the 4080 Super and they sell out so fast that the scalpers come in and all this stuff happens. And they've been listing at like $1,400. So it's great if you say, oh, we're re-releasing the Super to lower the MSRP to make this more competitive. But then if you had a product that was sitting there not selling at $1,200, and so you make a replacement to price adjust and it drives the price up instead of down, that's like the exact opposite effect, and it blows my mind. Like, I'm sitting here wondering, like, how is anybody selling these at a scalped price? Because nobody wanted them at the higher price, and now you're trying to like be a scalper and sell them at a higher price. Like, nobody wanted the product before and it was available, so why are they going to want it now? And I just hope nobody out there, and I hope you guys aren't buying these 4080 Supers at like $1,200. I've seen them for sale $1,400. Don't do that. Don't do that. It it has always been the 4080 has always been a bad value at $1,200. And the only reason anybody's even talking about him again is because the MSRP is supposed to be $999. So if you're purchasing this card and it's like not $999 or damn close to that, I wouldn't recommend it. But besides for the pricing, there's a lot of other things that go into the comparison of these two cards. So the first thing I'll bring up, and the 4080 does have a lot of strengths here. So power consumption. I've always been a gamer that has never cared about power consumption. I was just like, it's kind of like the saying goes, I didn't buy my Corvette for its fuel economy. You know what I mean? I bought it for the performance type of deal. So I've never cared about power consumption. But I got another kid coming, and so he's kicked me out of my gaming room. He's not even here yet, and he's kicked me out of my gaming room. And so now I'm up kind of hanging out in my attic, which I actually ended up loving it up here. But I'm not going to lie to you, the wiring's not exactly up to code. You know what I mean? So power consumption is all of a sudden gone from a non-factor for me personally to a big factor, because I started plugging in some of my stuff up here and I was blowing circuit breakers left and right. So, when I'm just doing gaming type loads, the AMD, you can go back and look at the footage. It regularly pulls like 350, damn near 400 watts. And the 4080 was much closer to about 200, low 200s. And then just to go back and forth, so what are the cons then? Well, the 16 gigs of VRAM. So the 4080 has 16 gigs of VRAM and the 7900 XTX has 24. I'll tell you, I've been using the 7900 XTX for 9 months or so, and it's really nice to just never have to worry about the VRAM. I never even had to consider it. Like, there's nothing that's going to touch 24 gigs of VRAM in gaming, I should say. There are other applications, of course, out there that do. But in gaming, there's just nothing that's even going to come close to touching it. And 16 seems pretty good on the 4080, but this is NVIDIA's thing, is they never want to give you too much of a good thing. Because if they would have gave you too much VRAM on this card, you would never upgrade. And the thing about VRAM is, gaming in general, like half of all gamers are on console. So you always got to look at the consoles because nobody's going to cut them out of the picture. They're half of all gamers. So, your average console, not your average console, both the Xbox and the PlayStation, they both have 16 gigs of shared memory. And that's shared. So it's got to go between, the CPU and GPU. But generally, they say it can flex up to about 12 gigs. But they're running, either 4K or they're doing some upscaling depending on the situation, and they're running lower settings. So it's not as much of a concern for them. If you're on the computer, you're trying to absolutely max the settings, trying to max everything out because you're spending $1,000 on this card, that makes sense, right? You're going to eat up the VRAM a little bit faster. But I think you're pretty safe for now with the 16. There were a couple of games. In fact, actually, I was surprised. Resident Evil 4, if you go back and look at the footage, it was like allocating like right at like 16 gigs on the NVIDIA, which then I was worried like, hey, maybe this is going to be a problem. But it absolutely did not slow it down because it absolutely destroyed the AMD on that benchmark. But I say all this to say is I don't see the 4080 lasting longer than this generation of consoles, which I think that, we're probably 2 to 3 years out on the next gen of console. I don't see the PS6 or anything like that coming out before, probably 2026 or 2027. But I'd be willing to bet that those consoles have significantly more memory in them. And when that happens, it'll open up the door for game developers to utilize that memory. And when that happens, they're going to do it because it gives them freedom in their game design. So NVIDIA knows this, and they know if they give you too good of a card, you'll never upgrade again. That's what they did with the 1080 Ti. The 1080 Ti was so good that you didn't have to upgrade for generations. I mean, there's people still rocking those things completely happy. So they're always going to give you just the bare minimums. That's why they're still selling, you know, $400 8GB cards. You're spending $1,000 plus on this 4080, and they're just going to give you the 16 gigs. You know, cheaper cards from AMD last gen had 16 gigs of VRAM. So, although that's not a problem right now, it's just a little bit aggravating to me that they always want to charge a premium, and I know what they're doing. They're just making sure that it's good now, but it's not going to be good for too long. That way I keep coming back and buying, which is great. It's great marketing on their part, but it's a little bit aggravating to me, the consumer. So with that, you know, those are kind of my big concerns. The Radeon card, I got under MSRP. It feels premium. The Gigabyte card, the NVIDIA card, I know this doesn't apply to all 4080s, but just I'm paying $50 up on the MSRP. I paid $1,049 versus the $999 MSRP, and it just doesn't feel like there's any premium there to it. It just feels like they threw a light on it so they could charge me an extra $50. Power consumption, way better on the NVIDIA, and suddenly that matters in my life. So it is what it is. The NVIDIA is killing it on that. I appreciate it. VRAM, not a problem today. Kind of just makes me mad. It's like, why can't you just give me a little bit more? And then the pricing. These are both comparable cards at this point. They both technically have a $999 MSRP. I think the Radeon you're going to get for less than that. The NVIDIA you're probably going to pay for a little bit more. If you are buying the NVIDIA at MSRP, I think this is a no-brainer decision. Because you get also all the additional software package type stuff. You get DLSS. DLSS is just better than FSR. It is 100%. I've got footage of Alan Wake 2 and DLSS. You look at the windows and they look like windows. And on AMD with the FSR, you look at the windows and they look like particles. They're so shiny and flashy and not even shiny. They're like sparkly. It looks like somebody shit glitter all over them. It's freaking terrible. And you look at that, and that's what kind of bugs me, because that ties back into pricing. So for AMD, you know, it's still $1,000 card. And to me, $1,000 card, you're looking at, I should be expecting a very premium product. And from the actual physical card, AMD killed it. It feels premium. It's got tons of metal on it. It's got great mix of materials. It's got a great look to it. It's got a very solid, understood design. But then you get into the gameplay, and suddenly the windows look like trash, and it totally pulls you out of the game, because you're just like, wait, what the heck am I looking at? Like, what is going on here? And then it doesn't feel premium anymore. And that's like my big problem with AMD is, after I spend like a certain level of money, like for me specifically, like I think if you're spending anything over like $600 to $700, for me personally, this number is gonna be different for different people, but like that's where I'm crossing into the realm of like, I really need a premium product. And my experience with FSR, it just doesn't feel very premium. It feels like the Kmart brand upscaler. It displays funny artifacts, like in the sense that, you know, there's just sparkles everywhere, there's all this stuff. And so with the NVIDIA, you get all these benefits. You get the better upscaler. If you are interested in frame generation, I personally am really not, but at this point in time at least. But if you are, you get that. You get everything that comes with DLSS 3.0. So if you're apples to apples, and the price is about the same or within $100, the NVIDIA is an absolute no-brainer. And so I think pretty soon we're going to approach a point, unless AMD continues to lower their pricing, where the 4080 Super is a no-brainer win. But as of me making this video, the prices are still out of control. And if you're looking at paying between $1,200 and $1,400 for the 4080 Super, to me, it's no longer a comparison between AMD and it. It's just a purely, is this performance worth this amount of money? And the 4080 Super is a very good performer, but it is not worth $1,200 to $1,400. And that's why the 4080, the original 4080 never sold well. Because it's a good performing card. I mean, you saw it's doing native 4K yet at reasonable frames, but it is not a $1,200 to $1,400 card by any stretch of the imagination. The $999 was just bringing it like into the realm of reasonable for its performance. So as long as these prices are out of control and things keep selling out and scalpers are out there and all this type of stuff, I can't really recommend the 4080. But if you start finding these things in stock at $999, to me at this point, if the AMD is still $920, or even if the 7900 XTX goes to $900, to me the benefits of the higher, more consistent frames, we saw that in the 1% lows, the additional software package, the ability, if I want to run the ray tracing, all of that is easily worth the extra $100 to me, at least. So at this point, if you can get it at MSRP, I think it's a no-brainer for the 4080. And ultimately, if you haven't figured it out yet, because it's still in my computer, I can't show it to you, it is the card I'm going to keep. So I kind of bought it as a trial to see what I wanted to do, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I've absolutely loved this Red Devil card. In fact, it inspired me to do a whole build because it was right when Diablo 4 was coming out, and unfortunately that kind of turned out to be a turd too. But I've always been a huge Diablo fan since like the 90s, playing Diablo 1, and this Red Devil card comes out, and it was looking real promising, so I threw this whole thing together and I just made this monster of a build. But that time is passed because, like I said, it was just my computer by itself was just blowing circuit breakers in my house. So I know what you're thinking. I need to get an electrician up here and fix it. But you know what? I threw this 4080 in there and stopped having the problem. So it turns out just that little bit of difference, little energy efficiency, really saved me. But with that, I think we've covered just about everything. I'm going to be rocking the 4080, until next gen comes out and I reevaluate. But ultimately, I think it is, just because of the pricing, a little bit of a hard decision. And this is not like a me hating on AMD or NVIDIA or anything. In fact, I think sub $500, AMD absolutely destroys. And I still love their products. I'm just having a little bit of a problem with their, what I would consider premium products. The performance is giving me in certain areas. And I don't feel like you can really sell, $1,000 card that has some of the issues that it has, specifically, with the upscaler and ray tracing performance. But in the sub $500, I'm looking at, I don't even want to consider ray tracing. So that comes off the table, and, the upscaler becomes a little less important, and I don't feel like I'm paying out, an absurd amount of money. So the experience is a lot better. Like, I think the 6700 is still one of the best value cards. $330. I'd still rock that way before 4060 or any of these other things. So I think there's a place in the world for AMD. I'm just not 100% sure if it's the really premium market. And I think they kind of get that too, because all the rumors point to that next generation, they're just going to bypass the flagship. They're not even going to try to make one. They're just going to make, a mid-grade card and sell it at a great value, which is honestly what Radeon, the video card department of AMD, that's where they've always shined. Like they've never made that good of a premium card. And so they're playing to their strengths, at least next generation. So we'll have to see how that goes. that's enough from me. Hope you all enjoyed, and let me know in the comments, if you're rocking either one of these cards or which one you prefer.